for joining us today for our Grief, a Faithful Ally for the Journey Ahead. And this is for people living with the disease, newly diagnosed, early stage. This is the first program that we've had like this, so thank you for attending today. And just a little housekeeping, if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to put that in the chat or the Q&A or the chat function at the very bottom. If you can see my screen, you probably can't. So if you go to the very bottom or the top, depending on where your bar is, it's little balloons with 3 dots in it, and that's the chat. So you can put in your question there anytime throughout this presentation, but we will allow about 10 minutes at the end of the program for any questions that you may have, and you can come off mute. My name is Erin Gillespie, and I'm the Director of Programs for the Alzheimer's Association, Greater Kentucky and Southern Indiana. I've been in the nonprofit space for a little over a decade, and I also was a caregiver for my grandmother who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Secondly, I would like to introduce Erin Kamain, who is the Manager and Health Community Outreach person at the Hospice Health. And then Aaron Guthrie. We have a lot of Aarons today, if you haven't noticed. So Aaron Guthrie is a therapist at U of L Trigger Optimal Aging Clinic and a PRN at the Hospice Health. And then finally, Joe, Program Manager at Hospice Health Grief Counseling Center. Joe is a licensed counselor with over 35 years of experience supporting those coping with illness, end of life, and bereavement, including a combined 23 years with Hospice Health, a community-based hospice program, and 10 years at Gilda's Club Kentuckiana, a clubhouse model and program of support from anyone whose lives are touched by cancer. He looks at grief as a creative opportunity to collaborate with change and sees it as a healing, adaptive response to loss. Joe is also a past caregiver for his father and grandmother who were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, sharing in their care with his stepmother and siblings. So these will be our presenters today. So again, thank you. And if you have any questions pressing, we will be checking out the chat throughout the presentation. So you may hear some of us come offline to be able to answer some of those questions. But again, we will leave some time at the end. We will be doing our program, and then we'll also share some resources towards the end of the program. This will be recorded. I will push record here in a second. I tend to forget that sometimes. So this will be recorded. And if you would like the recording afterwards, please let me know. I do have everyone's email addresses, and we'll be sending out the resources and things afterwards as well. All right, I will let you all begin, and I am going to push record, and then we can get started. That's all right.
There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe. I'm with Hospice Health, a grief counseling center here in Louisville, Kentucky. Thank you for allowing us to spend time with you today. We're here today, Erin and I, to talk a little bit about grief itself as an ally for the journey ahead, right? So we wanted to just make sure that our focus today is really on grief and understanding what grief is. We don't intend on being prescriptive and what we should do in our grief, so much as really understanding what grief is and how we can utilize that as an ally for the journey ahead. So we wanted to start today with just asking a question out there and asking you to consider, what is grief? I'll just allow you a few seconds just to think about your answer for that. What is grief? And so many of you probably would have been thinking of a feeling or several different feelings. You might think about the event of a new diagnosis, having heard the label dementia or Alzheimer's. You might think of past experiences that you've had when you've encountered the disease. But if I were to ask you, what is the purpose of grief, right? that probably changes the answer, because most of the time we think of grief as a reaction to an event, and the feelings that we have, the emotion we have at that event. But if we ask what is the purpose, then it begins to allow grief to be something more than that, right? So when we talk about what is grief, we want to understand grief, or we encourage you to think about grief as a normal, expected, and healthy response to loss. That grief is the whole relationship with something. It isn't just the emotion. It isn't just sadness, loneliness, and fear. It's also the fullness of the experience that includes a deeper appreciation for life, moments of unexpected joy, moments of awareness of intimate connection with others. So grief is our whole relationship with this new experience and life event that we are adapting to. It is also an evolved stress response, right? When we think about grief, it evolved from our primary instinct for survival. And so we'll talk about that a little further in the presentation. So we encourage you to think about grief as both a reaction to a new diagnosis, right? But also a response to it. Grief allows us to have a response. In fact, that response is necessary. But grief is the process by which we mobilize to respond to that event. That I feel and react to what is happening is part of grief, right? We are allowed to react to grief. We're allowed to feel about it, to fear about it, to rage about it, to protest against it. We're allowed to have our reaction to grief, and it is necessary that we do so. In order to mobilize how we cope, we need to first recognize that a threat has occurred, right? We need to be able to acknowledge that and receive that both on a brain level, on a body level. And once we register and react to grief, then we're allowed to mobilize our response to it, right? So when we think about our response to grief, really what happens is when you receive a diagnosis, in this case, right, when you hear the word dementia, you take that in, your body takes that in, and your brain immediately assesses whether that is a good thing or if it's a threat to your survival, right? And so our brain assumes that it is a threat, right, to our survival, and a threat is assessed immediately. Our autonomic nervous system, our sympathetic nervous system kicks into action. Our body and brain mobilize to defend and protect us, right? And so all of our brain function focuses on what we can do to address the threat, to help us to feel safe, to help us be resilient in the face of this new challenge. So when we think about that, our midbrain becomes very involved in resourcing data that informs our best action. We go into survival mode. And so our midbrain both takes in external data through our senses, right? What do I need to know about this? What do I need to do about this? Who can I ask? We resource information through all of our available sensory input, our 5 senses, right? What we see, what we hear, and take in all that data, right? We also revisit past experience with this disease, right? Everything we've heard about it, read about it in the past, seen on TV, heard from personal experience with our families. And our brain takes all of that data to try to mobilize our best response to that. So when you think about it, grief really is a response that mobilizes our defenses to best react and plan for how to best address the challenge of a new diagnosis. But what happens too is our brain narrows its function to conserve and direct our energy. So immediately, especially following a diagnosis, all of our brain bandwidth narrows so that we can focus our energy to survival, to our brainstem, which means that our neocortex, right, the big part of our frontal lobe, kind of has less ability to handle things like decision making, to handle things like impulse control, to remember short-term things, because all of our brain energy is focused on survival. So actually our neocortex, which is our rational part of the brain for planning and sorting, scheduling, all becomes less active until we mobilize our response, right? So our autonomic nervous system is really stepping on the gas so that we can react to a new diagnosis and figure out how we're going to react. As part of that, right, our feelings are there to inform our response, right? And oftentimes when we think of grief, most people define the heavy sadness, the anger, the fear as things that are unwanted, and things that are just, we're on the receiving end of them. We don't tend to see these as helpful allies. And the truth is, all of our feelings are in fact allies for us if we take a second look at them and allow them to be, right? Even things like sadness, when we think about grief as an evolved survival mechanism, right, as an ally in our grief, it's helpful to think in terms of our evolution, right? Things that are superfluous, things we don't need, tend to fall away. The truth is we no longer have a tail because we don't need a tail for balance, right? And for gripping things. We have a tailbone, that evidence that we had a tail, but we don't need that anymore. So as we evolve, things that are superfluous or that are unnecessary tend to fall away. The thing about feelings is they have always stayed with us, and they have evolved and nuanced into all the different feelings that we can possibly experience, which means that they are useful by definition. So let's take a look at those, right? So let's just think about sadness, anger, and fear for a minute. Sadness, right? When we are feeling sad, what actually happens within us is that it prompts contemplation. It causes us to pause. It causes us to withdraw, to think more thoughtfully about things and assess them, to evaluate them, to discern their value and their meaning, right? All animals in the wild, when they are injured or wounded, they retire to their lair or their den and they lick their wounds and they step out of life for a while to sort of get their second wind, right? And they sort of heal their wounds until they're ready to step out and get back into life again. Sadness has that same function for us. It allows us to step out of the immediacy of life and create a space where we can stop, get our second wind, and think thoughtfully about what our next response should be, right? Anger is similar. When we think of anger, think of any wild animal that is angry, right? So an example, I was backpacking and I came across a mama bear who was near her two cubs. Turns out I was a little too near the cubs as well. And she got really angry with me, right? And she rose up big and strong. Now, her anger was really a protective maneuver. It was meant to scare me away, right? So that she could protect herself and her cubs. And it was very effective, right? Anger does the same thing for us. It carves a space out where we can have others take a step back to, again, buy some time to regroup, to rethink, to reassess our situation, to think about our safety, and our best action for keeping ourselves safe moving forward. The other thing about anger is that it creates energy in us. When we are under stress and when we are afraid and when we feel threatened and anger, part of our stress response actually mobilizes stress hormones in our system to prepare us to fight or to run away really fast. So that all those stress hormones create opportunity for energy to do something, to physically act, right? So anger itself as a response connects us to that potential energy to do. So it overcomes the tendency to withdraw, right? Sadness pulls us back. Anger gives us the energy to respond. When we think about fear, most of us don't enjoy feeling the feeling of fear, but when you think about fear, what does it do for us? And when we're afraid, right, we become more aware, we become more alert. Think about an experience that you've had, maybe leaving work late at night, and you're stepping out and you're the only car in the parking lot, and the parking lot is, there's a lot of space between you and your car at the other end of the parking lot, right? And it's dark and not well lit. You might become fearful, right? And so what that fear does is allow you to be more aware. Your hearing becomes more acute, your eyes become more acute, your vision becomes more acute. You become more focused on the immediate and the present to assess fear, and if there is a sign of danger, to be prepared to respond to it. So fear is actually a very helpful feeling to have because it allows us to better assess, pay attention to the immediate situation, and mobilize our best defense to address the threat. Happiness is also a good feeling, right? Most of us don't have an argument with happiness. We enjoy feeling it, right? But happiness serves a purpose too. It isn't just a reaction, but it is a reaction that rewards us and encourages us to keep doing the things that are helpful for us. So when you think about the grief of a response to a diagnosis, we need to remember that that it is a physiological process, right? It's a stress response that is mobilizing our defenses, right? It taps into our fight or flight response, which mobilizes our coping. We first have to recognize that there's a threat with this diagnosis, but then our body naturally, our brain naturally respond to that, to mobilize our response to that. And we are wonderfully, beautifully made for that to happen. Part of that response includes our feelings, sadness, anger, fear, and happiness being kind of the primary feelings we're used to feeling, and other feelings being nuances of that. But even those feelings serve to help us assess the situation and mobilize what we're going to do about this new situation, right?
Joe, if I
Yeah.
could just pop in really quickly. So, a lot of times people will talk about with me when I'm talking to them one on one or in groups about feelings, and they'll start to get very concerned that they're going to experience one feeling too much. Or that it will overtake them, or I'm going to get drowned by anger, or I'm going to get drowned by sadness, or I'm going to become so fearful that I can't move. And I think you might agree, we also hear that sometimes with grief, that feeling, if I experience this, it is going to flood me and overtake me. And so we'll spend a lot of energy trying to keep these feelings at arm's length and keep them at bay. And sometimes that ends up with us, like saying we don't have the feelings, or really leaning in sometimes to false positives, and being overly optimistic. One of the things that I think is so important for people to remember is that feelings typically come and go. What did we decide, Joe? We were talking about it, like about 5 minutes. If you're having a really intense feeling of anger or sadness or fear, or even the good ones like happiness and excitement, our bodies are designed to feel them intensely for a very short amount of time in the grand scheme of things. And so if we sort of consider it, a lot of people will use the wave analogy of allowing it like the ocean waves come in and they go back out, that if we'll allow ourselves to experience these feelings, we will often find that the really intense ones will come and go fairly quickly. If they get stuck, then there are things we can do about that. But most of the time, our bodies are designed to be able to ride that wave of intensity. And so really sometimes when we get into the worst shape is when we try not to have the feelings, because feelings like to be heard. So thanks for letting me add that.
Absolutely. So one of the feelings that we often hear, most people are familiar with Kubler-Ross and the stages of coping with a diagnosis or life-limiting illness or life-threatening illness. And so most people are familiar with denial, right? And anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance, right? And so the one we want to focus on here is acceptance, right? And why is that necessary, right? When we are first diagnosed with an illness or there's a life change and our grief is activated, right? We go through those same kinds of feelings, right? We go through denial and we experience anger. This can't be happening to me. You must be wrong. This isn't fair, right? There's protest and we bargain, right? And we cut deals and we imagine ways we can undo this diagnosis. And then we get to a point of depression, which is part of that reality settling in that, no, this is real and this is my life at this moment, right? This is part of who I am now. And at that point, we struggle with this idea of acceptance. And it's important when we talk about that feeling that we do not mean that it means that acceptance means I feel this is right, or I agree with this, or this is a good time in my life for this, or in the scheme of things, why not me? Acceptance only means that I accept the reality of this new diagnosis and this new situation, right? That I accept that this is the truth for me at this point moving forward, and the consequences of that, whatever they be. That acceptance that this is real for me and this is happening is kind of is an essential part of our coping, right? It is not an inaction, it is not forgetting, and it is not avoidance. Instead, acceptance is accepting the knowledge of what I have, what it is, and what will come, right? And it's the turning point. It's almost as if we were talking in a group of people who were struggling with addiction, and they talk about hitting that place of bottom, right? This point of acceptance gives us something then to push against. It's as if grief asks us, right, to respond to this new situation. And then it asks us the question, and now what are we going to do about it, right? That's the turning point, right? It recognizes that the diagnosis is real. It recognizes and names what is happening here and now. So when we talk about grief, it is both a reaction to respond to what has happened and what will happen. And it is also an action, a response to that, that I can choose how I grieve and what actions I will take to cope with this new diagnosis. So in the background, Aaron put in that yin-yang symbol. I want to just look at that for a minute, right? And there's several things to notice about that symbol that I think are really germane to our conversation today, right? Grief is sort of this ebb and flow between positive and negative, between hopefulness and hopelessness, between happiness and joy. And do you see in the symbol, the white pushes into the black and the black pushes into the white? Grief is dynamic, it's always flowing. And what Aaron just said a moment ago about feeling states, right? When I'm in the midst of a feeling, right, that feeling is always pushing into another feeling and becomes another feeling. Feelings are not stagnant. One moves fluidly into another. And so when you look at this feeling, let's say the white is happiness, right? And the black is sadness. So what this means is it's sort of like when I'm feeling happy, right, there's this push into my happiness and sadness comes in, right? But while I'm sad, there's this push for joy to come back. So that feelings are always kind of counterbalancing themselves. And so our feelings actually are fluid, and we can trust that. That is the habit of grief. That is its function, right? And so part of when we think about grief as being an ally is to just sort of process and allow that flow to happen. What's also interesting about this image is when you have moments of joy, right? There's always a little bit of sadness in that going forward. But when you have moments of sadness, there's always a little bit of joy in that. There's always a little bit of opposite in that ebb and flow. And I think that's really a strong image to kind of meditate on when we think about grief as a healing response to a loss event. So when we think about engaging with our grief, I encourage you to think about grief in three ways, right? Most of us are used to thinking about grief as an uninvited guest. And we've all had an uninvited guest in our life, right? Someone who came in, didn't know they were on the invite list, and they refused to leave, right? But being good hosts, we welcome them into our homes, we welcome them into our lives, and we begin to get to know them, right? Or if you've had that college roommate, right, that you didn't know before you got into the dorm room, or for many of us, when we first move in with our spouse, we just know that it's a perfect match until we start living together. And then we begin to learn each other's nuance. And I'd like you to think about grief as that. Think about grief as this new person in your life that you're getting to know, right? You want to observe them and learn them, and learn to care for them, right? And learn to respond to them and how you interact with each other, much like you would have done with your spouse or life partner when you first started living together. You can also think about grief as a teacher and mentor, because part of the function of grief, right, is to cause us to pause when our life is going along well, right? We tend to go right along with the flow and enjoy it, right? But it's only at times of great upheaval, of great loss, of great change, that we have the wind knocked out of us long enough that we stop, and we have no choice but to pause and take our second breath, and then reevaluate our situation, reassess our situation, and stop and think, now what am I going to do next, right? So grief can be a teacher and a mentor in that way, right? It can cause us to become deeply reflective in our lives, think about the things that we truly value, the things that are most important, and we reassess our priorities oftentimes when we're grieving, right? So grief can be a teacher and a mentor in that way. It can also be a companion, right? Because grief pulls us to our past. It pulls us ahead to our future, right? And it's something that causes us to do an awful lot of remembering and reflecting, and seeking out of others. So it can become a source of company and comfort for us in unexpected ways. So when we think about grief, right, as an uninvited guest, a teacher, mentor, and a companion, we begin to allow grief to be more than an unwanted response to a new diagnosis. And so when we think about engaging with our grief, what we'd like to encourage you to do is to observe and learn its nuance. And so I'm going to give you an example of that from bereavement side of things. Worked with a man named Don, and Don came into a support group, and we were encouraging to get to know his grief. And so when he came into group, we said, how's it going? And he said, well, I'm learning that my first encounter with grief is before I even get out of bed in the morning, and I don't like it. And as he got to know his grief, he understood that one of the first things that happened in his day when his wife was living was that he would make coffee for her, and they would enjoy their first cup of coffee together before they did anything during the day, right? And so as he learned and observed his grief, he learned its patterns and where it showed up and how it showed up. And then once he knew that, he could determine what he does about that, right? How he responds to it. And so he came up with a solution along with the group and their brainstorming, that if it was about not being able to have coffee with his wife, how could he now have coffee with his wife? And what he's learned was he could brew the cup of the coffee. He could pour his coffee into her coffee mug and use her coffee mug this day going forward. And in that way, they were still having coffee together in a different way, but still creating that ritual that was familiar. And it was that learning his grief, learning its patterns, when he encountered it, when does it appear, what does it feel like? He got to know his grief in order to be able to respond to it and take care of it. Grief needs something from us. Our grief needs our care. It needs our attention, and it will let us know when it needs that attention, right? But it's also curious to think about what grief needs from us, right? And what we need from it. When we think about what do I need from my grief? What does it have to show me, to teach me, right? And then what is my response going to be to that, right? So when you think about grief as this sort of response, reaction and response, think of it as a process like breathing, right? There's this natural ebb and flow between encountering our grief, wanting to avoid it, being comforted by our grief, being disturbed by our grief, and it's automatic. It's part of our natural gift for coping. And we'd like you to begin thinking about grief as this sort of natural ebb and flow that will lead you to what it needs, and provide you also with what you need. And so today we thought we would spend some time brainstorming this idea of getting to know grief and engaging with it, with one of common and sometimes one of the most difficult parts of living with a new diagnosis of dementia, and that is the loss of driving independence. And so I'm going to pull Erin in here to just talk a little bit more from her experience about that particular event that is part of the journey ahead, and maybe walk us through and brainstorm some ideas about engaging with our grief and what it means when we look at this particular loss event.
So when people come, I do a lot of, almost all individual and family therapy all day long, every day. And certainly a significant number of people who come to me are often in early stages of diagnosis or now living with an illness of various sorts. As we thought about understanding that when people get diagnosed with anything, we're all individuals and we are going to experience the grief of it differently. But I can say hands down, the loss of driving independence comes into my office more than anything else. Because I think as adults, we just, for those of us who are driving, we have been driving wherever we want, whenever we want, however we want, when we need to, with maybe the exception of cars breaking down from time to time. For years, for decades. So if you think about how would I engage with the grief of either thinking about the fact that one day I might not be able to drive, or accepting that the time has come, or living with it after you've made the decision. Same thing as any kind of grief. We can anticipate it. We can be in the active process of grieving it, or we can be considering it as a past thing that we're now living with. And so just kind of thinking about how would you encounter the loss of driving independence? When does it appear? And it appears many times during the day, but for some people it might appear, well, I normally got in the car to drive myself to work, or whenever I wanted to go to the post office or go visit a friend. And what does it feel like when you are encountered with and remember that you would like to go do something that requires the keys to the car? What will that feel like? What does it feel like thinking about it today? And what would it feel like not being able to do it? And certainly, the four basic feelings, the fear and the sadness and the anger, the frustration, disappointment, certainly lots of feelings can come. And then the idea of what does it need from me is sort of a question of why am I feeling this way? And considering it. It's that idea of how sadness and anger can drive us deeper to consider things, because this isn't just driving a car. It can also signify a change in us that we didn't ask for, that we aren't ready for, that we didn't want to have happen. And these moments where we are face to face with things that have changed present us with a reminder of the things that are different. What does it need from me might be to consider also what things can be the same. And what do I need from it? And what is my response going to be if I just kind of bundle all three of those together for a second? Sitting here today, you might already begin to think, well, what will I do? Certainly one option is to just not go anywhere anymore. And just decide that I'll just stay at home. Another option would be, who's going to take me places and how is that going to happen? Am I going to make the decision of when I don't drive anymore? How will I navigate going to see friends, going to doctor's appointments, still getting to live the life that I want to live while understanding that I'm grieving and have deep feelings about no longer being able to do it the way I once did, and yet still wanting to live my life to the fullest that I possibly can in the face of this loss. And so that is the things that, as we move into the next slide, we're going to be talking about decisions that you can start making today that can impact and create a framework for how you're going to live with this diagnosis and live with the things that are going to be changing in your life, and give yourself a framework for how you want to respond to them and react to them using that language. Now, Joe mentioned in the beginning, this isn't prescriptive. We're not going to give you here's the 7 steps that you're going to take. You may make decisions today and then have to adjust those decisions later because things change. But I do think that there is something very powerful when we decide on principle what kind of person we are and how we want to live out our life, how we want to respond to the things and the challenges that face us. And you've been doing that your entire life, a lot of times without giving it much intentional cognitive thought. And so today we're going to talk about how you can put more thought into it, and really, even with your friends, with your loved ones, with yourself, and begin to consider what is going to direct and guide your response to this diagnosis. So do you want me to keep going?
Sure. Yeah. It made me think of what we did with my dad when he was early in his diagnosis. And it took a little bit of effort because he was not inclined to do so, but to sit down and have a conversation, several conversations about looking forward. If there is a benefit to be able to anticipate, it is that we can plan ahead and make our wishes known. And when we talked about that, it allowed us, not only him to live with integrity, but it allowed us as caregivers to make sure that we were honoring who he was and his wishes, and keep that continuity in the face of changing abilities and curveballs that were always a part of the process. It just allowed sort of the essence of who he was to be constant, and that he had a role in that from the start, right? I think is really important. So Erin, let me hand it back to you.
Sure. So the 3 C's is a framework that's often used. We call it the 3 C's plus 1 because we wanted to break them out just a little bit. But the idea, and again, these are just some broad principles, the idea is to make as many choices about things as you can now on your own with friends, choosing what who you've always been, the way you've always faced life and handled hardship or challenges or positive things and memories, and choose, what do I want to continue? What will I be a person who says, in the face of a loss like my driving independence, I will come up with other solutions to continue to go and be active as much as possible. To consider, as I begin to, maybe if I begin to withdraw more and isolate more, do I want to be in a situation that I will continue as long as possible to choose to go and be near friends and be near loved ones when I'm able? And so thinking about all the different things that you would like to choose today, knowing what you know today, knowing that you'll have different information tomorrow and next week and next month, but today, and then adjusting them as you go. The connect piece, so across the board, regardless of what it is, humans are designed for connection, and all of our markers are better when we stay connected with other people. From the time of infancy, the babies who learn to smile and like what they call flirting with adults get their needs met more often because of that connection piece. And so those babies get more attention. They might get more food. They might get held more often. And so from the very earliest moments, we are learning how valuable and how important connection is to getting our needs met. And those babies are healthy. We know without it, then people often become more frail and more fragile. And certainly, from studies years ago, we know there were failures to thrive in babies, and we still see it today if they aren't getting that kind of connection with other humans. We aren't any different. We may find that as we've gotten older, that maybe we don't like being around people as much as we once did, or we don't like large groups of people the way we once did. And that is okay. The connection piece does not have to look the same across the board. If you like being around 1 or 2 people, then let's not go to a large venue and be around 100. But making a decision and making a choice that you're going to connect with people as often as possible can have really positive health markers for you. And then you got to communicate it. So making sure that you tell people in your life. Now, this can be tough. A lot of times I'll talk to people and they say, well, when I start to talk to my family or friends about it, they become very emotional. And remember, I said a lot of times people will get very hesitant to engage with emotion. It's okay if they become emotional, and encouraging them that it's okay. This is an emotional thing, and it's an emotional conversation. And the reason emotions are often so high and so close to the surface is because of how much this means, how much these relationships mean to you and to them. And so certainly not allowing that adversity or feeling of wanting to be averse to difficult experiences, someone crying or someone having hard feelings, to keep us from communicating. And then that last one is the compromise piece. And that really recognizes that no plan ever goes exactly as designed. I think that probably the hallmark to me of successful people in this world are that they're able to adjust in a moment's notice when given a different set of input, when recognizing that this door is locked, and so I'm going to need to find another exit. That idea of being able to compromise, to come up with alternative solutions, to say, okay, the best laid plan isn't going to go exactly as we thought it would. Let's adjust. Still trying to keep with the principles that we initially set the plan on. And then just recognizing that the plan now needs to look differently. So those 4 things, as Joe and I discussed, like what is the most helpful thing? Because I think every individual is going to face different pieces one person might grieve one thing while another person doesn't grieve that at all, and they grieve something totally different. We all have different family situations, different communities, different experiences with our healthcare providers. And so the need to avoid a prescription is really us recognizing that there is not a one size fits all. But again, we think if you approach it with these 3 C's plus one, it gives you the framework then to be able to respond to your specific circumstances in a really meaningful way so that you can live the best quality of life possible every step of the way throughout your life.
Erin, I think I would add to that if there was a 5th C there, I would say courage, right? Because it takes an awful lot of intention, a lot of courage, a lot of bravery to initiate this kind of plan, this kind of approach, to think about things that are an unknown future, right? But things that you might anticipate happening. And with my father, part of the way that the questions that he considered was, when this happens, right? Or when the time comes that, right? He made kind of his wishes known that helped guide us. And I think that's such a gift. I think one of the things that I hear most often from people who are living with an illness, part of their fear is that they are burdensome to those they love, who will inevitably care for them. And being proactive and taking the time to have these brave conversations up front, to anticipate and to make them aware of your choices, even things like, how do I want to be involved in decision making, right? And what decisions, as I change over time, what decisions can I participate in, which can I not? All of those things, being brave enough to think through those and anticipate those, are really a gift that he gave to us to help us navigate his care and honor his essence, like throughout, right? I thought that was such an important thing, but courage would probably be the 5th C there.
So then we kind of left it with resources. Yeah, Aaron's popping on. Okay, because I was thinking we might need Aaron's assistance for who goes what, when next. Oh, you're still muted.
Yep. Aaron, did you want to go back or go through the resources?
Well,
Guthrie or?
Yeah, not me, Aaron, the other Aaron, right?
Yeah. Aaron C., you're on mute.
Well, thank you. And that was a wonderful presentation. And thank you, Erin, for inviting us. I am Erin Kamain. I am an outreach manager for Hospice Health, for the whole umbrella as far as hospice care, palliative care, and our grief counseling center. So my job is to connect and to be able to educate the community. So I will email some resources to Erin to be able to distribute out to you guys if you are interested in our hospice or palliative services.
Thank you. And I will briefly go through some of our resources. And thank you, Aaron and Joe. That was incredible information. I know that there's a lot of different stages when you get a diagnosis. And so thank you for bringing that information and personal experience as well to help connect the dots. Let me... And like I said, this information will be sent to you via email. Can you all see that? Okay.
Yeah.
And I'll briefly go through this. It's a lot of information, and I do still want to make sure we have time for some Q&A with the audience. But again, my name is Erin Gillespie, and I'm the Director of Programs. So I am the care and support pillar of our organization. We cover 125 counties throughout Southern Indiana and Kentucky. We have so many resources online and also in person. We know it's important that with this disease, you're not always available to get up and go. And so we do make sure that all of our information is also available online. I'll talk a little bit more about our 24/7 helpline here in the next slide. I do want to point out that it's not just for emergencies. This is a number you can call 24 hours, 7 days a week. It's 200 different languages, and it's not contracted out by a third party. It is our organization. I always like to point that out. We also have support groups. And I'll show you some here in a minute. Support groups for care partners, but also for those living with the disease. Education, if you want to know more about the disease and how it affects communication and behaviors in the brain itself. And then we also advocate at a state and national level. And of course, we have our Walk to End Alls, which is we have 12 throughout the state of Kentucky and Southern Indiana. This slide is a lot. I will I will go ahead and preface that I know it's a lot of information in one place, but I did want to kind of highlight just a few. Definitely our website. It is very bountiful, right? We know that there's a lot of information on our website. After this presentation, I will send you some quick links because if you just get on there and start searching, I do say that you should. But I'll give you some quick links. That way you can find things very quickly that are most relevant to where you're at today. Again, our 24/7 helpline, this is staffed by master level clinicians, but if you're having some anxieties or grief, even if it's like 2 o'clock in the morning, you can call this number if you just need to talk. If you need to find a different physician, and you're having a hard time finding someone in your area, you can call this number. If you have questions about the POA process, like how do I get a power of attorney? Who should be my power of attorney? You can call this number. So again, this is really a go-to. We know that this disease is not 9 to 5, and this is really an excellent number to call if you have any issues. And the second one I will point out on just this slide is our community resource finder. This is housed by AARP and the Alzheimer's Association. You can find support groups, education programs, physicians, in-home care, anything in this space, all by zip code. So I use this personally every day, but I know that it's also just a really quick stop to find something. Also, if you have a loved one in another area, it's helpful that everything's located by zip code. These are two things that I really encourage you to go on and look at. Our All's Connected is an online community for people living with the disease, caregivers, family, friends, neighbors. This is a time for you to be able to connect with other people that get it and give feedback and really just get resources from people that maybe be in a different stage than you. And also really making those connections like they talked about earlier. All's Navigator is, we often get people that call us that say, I just got diagnosed. I don't know what to do next. Or I'm starting to get further in through the stage of early stage, and I don't know if I should be driving anymore. So the All's Connector or All's Navigator is online tool. You answer a couple questions that are specific to your situation, and it spits out an action plan specific to you. So this is anywhere from what do I ask my doctor to driving. So there are several topics, and both of these were just redone, and they're just very, very helpful. And so this will be also some of the resources that I send you. I do really encourage you to go to our website, and you see it here. It's alz.org/help-support/I-have-alls. This is really, any topic that you can think of from, I just was diagnosed, what can I expect? to taking care of yourself, sharing your diagnosis. I know Joe talked a lot about, and we do as well, that you want to be able to be part of that decision making and what's going to happen in your future. Not only does that help you get to decide what happens to you, but also it reduces stress and anxiety for you and your care partner. So there's a lot of information on how to make some of those plans, what that looks like, how to share your diagnosis. I just recently had someone that I'm close to. Her husband was just recently diagnosed, and she's like, I don't know how to tell our family yet. His children don't know yet. It's just sometimes it can be hard opening that discussion up, and there is a lot of grief that comes with that. So there's some tips and strategies based on sharing your diagnosis and also reducing stress. Publications, if you're wondering about any stage of the disease, what to ask a doctor, any of the treatments now available, any research that's going on, safety. This is a one-stop shop for any topic you can think of. And then they're also printable PDFs. So you can share these PDFs with your family. Finally, we do have support groups, early stage support groups in Fayette County and in Louisville, where your care partner and the person with the disease comes to these support groups. I know sometimes it's like, oh, do I want to go to a support group? The verbiage of a support group, sometimes it can hinder people from coming, but I always say it's a great opportunity for education, but also resources, learning from your community, learning from the facilitators. All of them are trained by us and typically have either been a past caregiver or is a therapist or works in this aging space. So these are the two that we have. And I will note that in these support groups, you are not in the same room as your care partner. So everyone living with the disease has a separate group. So that way it's a safe space for you to, talk about what's going on in your life today without worrying about your partner being right next to you and what they're thinking. So again, both of these are one is in Fayette County in Lexington, and then the other is in Louisville. We also know it's very important that you stay socially active throughout this disease. It's still good for you to get out, and we do offer two social opportunities in Lexington and in Louisville, that it's a safe space to be around people that get it. And it's just a time to have fun. Sometimes there is a lot of grief and a lot of changes within this process through this disease. And sometimes it's not always happy rainbows, but we have two of these programs so you can be around other people that may be experiencing the same things, and that you can laugh and really interact with one another. And we have activities at both of these programs. And so now I will stop sharing my screen. And if anybody would like to come off mute, or if you have any questions and do not want to come off camera or off mute, you can always put that in the comment box. Any questions? I have a question for Hospice Health. Anybody that wants to answer it is, if someone is interested in one-on-one counseling, what areas do you all cover? And then also at Traeger too, what is involved with that? And are the counselors, do most of them know about dementia? Is that something that they should ask about when they first call to get one-on-one counseling?
Well, I can speak really quickly about Traeger. We do offer individual counseling. We have a lot of groups and things for caregivers and individuals here as well. We have a brain health clinic here, so we have a physician who leads that group. And so the one thing about for our counselors is that while we may not be complete experts in any particular diagnosis, trained in the art of counseling and in journeying alongside people. And we also have access then to physicians for guidance and questions and things of that nature that I think has really benefited everyone. I know it has me a great deal. And I think the number was on the slide, but if you look up the TraegerInstitute.org, there's a button that just pops up big that says request an appointment, and you just type in what you're looking for and someone will respond.
And is that available online, or you have to be in person in Louisville?
Yeah, we do online, and we do and it doesn't have to be, depending on where the clinicians are licensed. I'm licensed in Indiana and Kentucky, so it doesn't have to be only for Kentucky residents.
Thank you.
And I would add to that, second what Erin said regarding our availability of counselors. We're very skilled in working with living with a diagnosis, dementia being one of them. For those anticipating end of life and those who are bereaved after following a loss of life. We have offices in New Albany, Elizabethtown, Campbellsville, Bowling Green, Madisonville. Who did I leave out? Elizabethtown and Louisville. Oh yeah. And so our counseling services are available. We accept most insurances. And for those, if you have insurance, we do not accept. We provide services on a sliding scale, which goes to 0. And particularly for areas that are under-resourced and where connectivity is a challenge, maybe our offices might be a little bit more accessible. And we also provide services virtually as well. Best thing to do is start with a phone call. And you'll be connected with our practice manager, who kind of does a brief assessment of your need, and then we'll connect you with a counselor within 48 hours.
Perfect. Well, thank you. And I know we're a little bit past time, but I did want to thank Hospice Health, Aaron, and Joe for being here today and supplying us with this helpful and much needed information about grief. And if we do have another program on May 21st at the same time at 1 p.m. over grief, and this is for the care partner. I will send that information out also with some of these resources. So thank you again, everyone, for being here today. I hope you found it helpful, and look out for that email from myself, Erin Gillespie, with the resources and program. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.